to the default, which is the iPhone XR. And we want to fix our problem where our background image gets cut off when the orientation changes. So how can we do this? Well, essentially, we need this background to resize itself so that all four edges of that image is tied to the four edges of our screen, so that the top edge here is always sticking 0 pixels to the top of whatever orientation the screen's in. The right is always sticking 0 pixels to the right of the screen. The bottom is 0 from the bottom, and the left is 0 from the left. But of course, we can't just adjust our image like so, because as soon as we flip back to the other orientation, it stays exactly the same. So we need to add some rules or constraints onto this image view. And that is what we're going to tackle in this lesson. To begin, let's make sure that you also have the same size class selected, the iPhone XR, and that it's in portrait mode. And then we're going to select our App Brewery background image view, and we're going to resize it so that it fits the entire screen of our iPhone XR. And then we're going to make sure that our logo is bang in the middle of our screen. So this is kind of our desired look, at least in portrait. From here, we're going to add some constraints to our App Brewery background so that even when it's in landscape or on a different device, it still is touching all four sides of the phone and it's stretching to fit the entire screen. And then we're going to go and click on this button right here, the little square button, which is going to allow us to add a constraint. And the constraint that we want to add is to specify a 0 pixel distance from the top of the phone, 0 from the left, 0 from the right, and 0 from the bottom. So we're going to click on these red lines and turn them from these dashed lines to solid lines to activate those four constraints. And then we're simply going to click on this button. Now, if you don't see 0 in each of these boxes, then go back and make sure that your background is placed exactly like so and it's fitting the entire screen. Once you're done, go ahead and click Add 4 Constraints. And now when we go into our landscape orientation, you can see that our background image view is now more or less stretching to fit the entire space. But there's a couple of problems here. Firstly, why is it that our background is not going all the way to the left and right? What's going on there? Well, we can actually explore our constraints and figure out what's gone wrong with them by expanding our constraints here, and we can see what these constraints or rules are doing to our user interface. So the first one is a rule that says the right side or the trailing side, as highlighted here, of our App Brewery background should be equal to the safe areas trailing. So this means that when our phone goes into landscape, the safe area is the area which normally contains either the battery information or the signal information of the phone, and at the bottom of the iPhone XR, it's the home button essentially. It's the part which you swipe to go back to the home area. So often if we're creating an app that has buttons on it, then we don't want it to be in these safe areas. So we'll define rules that keeps it out of these areas. But in our case, because it's just a background, we want our background to actually cover the entire screen rather than have this sort of blocky effect. So we actually don't want it to be set to the safe areas trailing. And in fact, we want it to be set to the super view. So this is our current element. The super view is the view that contains this element. And this super view that's at the base of our view controller is always going to be covering the entire screen. So we want to define this constraint. Rather than relative to the safe area, we're going to define it to the super view. So this one right here. And we're going to say that it should be equal to the super view's trailing. So now our app background, the trailing, the right side edge, is now fitted to be 0 pixels from the trailing edge of our view. So that's the one that's highlighted in blue right here. And if we now go into landscape, you can see it's now fitting right to the edge of that right side or the trailing side. So let's go ahead and fix the same thing with our leading view. So you can see we've got our app background leading set to be equal to the safe area leading. So let's go ahead and change that from safe area to the super view. And now when we go into landscape, you can see that it looks perfect as it is. Now you can see that each of these rules, when you click on them, you can view them in more detail in the attribute pane. And you can see the rules that have been set up here that set the constraint between a first item and a second item and the relationship between them. So for example, if I wanted my app background top to stop at the safe area, then I would change this to my safe area and change that constant to 0. So the top of my image view is now 0 from the top of my safe area. And if you want to see where the safe area actually is, you can simply click on it here and you can see where it stops on the top and the bottom, and also in the landscape orientation as well. Let's restore that constraint back to what it used to be, which is where the top is equal to the top of the super view. And let's look at another thing. If we take a look at the trailing, so the one on the right, it's currently set to the super view's trailing, but we can also set it to be relative to the margin. So the margin is that thing that pops up when we have an element that we drag to the right or to the left. You can see that blue line that pops up. And often when you have a button or when you have a logo, you don't want it to be right to the edge because it's hard to read. And instead, you want it to have a little bit of a margin to the edges. So in that case, you can define this to be relative to the margin of the super view's trailing area. So if I select that, then change my constant to 0 and hit enter, you can see it's now limiting my background to that margin. So these are some of the things that you can do with your constraints, and when you add them using the menu here, they don't always get added the way that you think it will. You can have a little bit more control over it if you click on the drop-down list. So for example, if I select my logo here and I click on here, then you can see that I can define it relative to the safe area or to the view. And I can change the distance or the value from those areas. So our background is now pretty much sorted. And if we take a look at all the different device sizes, all the way from small ones to large ones, it's basically adapting it to fit the entire screen background. And even when we change the orientation, it still looks pretty good. The next thing to do is to figure out how we can lay out our logo. And to do that, we need to learn about alignment. And that is what we're going to do on the next lesson. So I'll see you there. The next thing to tackle is, of course, our logo. And we want it to be centered in the screen in all orientations and device sizes. So let's first bring it to the middle where we want it, so we can see these margin lines pop up. And now that it's bang in the middle, we have two options, right? We could simply go ahead and do what we learned before, which is where we select it and add the constraint so that it's pinned to the edges of the super view. But this is not going to look very good when we turn to landscape, because it's unable to have 300 from the top and 300 from the bottom, because now that the phone is in landscape, there isn't so much vertical space. So let's hit Command Z to undo all of those constraints. So we're now left with our Appbury logo without any constraints. Instead, let's go ahead and click on the alignment button here and align it to be horizontally in the container and vertically in the container. So let's add those two constraints. And now when we turn to landscape, you can see it works just perfect. It behaves exactly the way we want it to. Now that's pretty easy, and it means that we're leaving the phone to work out the size of the screen that it's being rendered on and place the element in the center, even if it's on an iPad or on an iPhone 4 device. So when we think about adding constraints, we can think about it in terms of pinning, where we add these constraints that define the distance between our element and the containing view. And when we turn our phone, in this case, the landscape, it'll try to fit it still to the edges. But of course, some of these will have to break because we can no longer afford 100 pixels, say in this case, from the top and 100 pixels from the bottom. There isn't that amount of vertical space anymore. The alternative to this pinning method is by using the alignment technique, where we say that we want to align our button horizontally in the center of our screen as well as vertically in the center. So now when our phone turns, our button is going to forever remain in the middle. Now we can also use a combination of these two techniques where we say that our button needs to be in the horizontal center of the phone, but it also needs to be constrained so that it's always 30 points from the bottom of the safe area. So now when our phone turns, it's going to keep all of those rules, and it's going to look slightly different from before where it was just simply in the middle of the screen. But we're now using a combination of both alignment, which aligns to the center vertically or horizontally, as well as pinning, where we add a distance that our element needs to be from the edge of its containing view. So let's restore our size class to the iPhone XR, and let's think about how we can use what we've just learned. Now, if we go into the object library and drag on a new label, so just below our logo, and then go ahead and style and edit the label however you want. In my case, I'm simply going to change it to a company tagline. And now I'm going to change its color, and I want it to be a little bit below my logo, but in the horizontal center of the app. So now here's a challenge. Add some constraints to the label to make it centered in the horizontal axis, but make sure it's also about 30 pixels below that logo, even when we turn to landscape. So pause the video and try to complete that challenge. All right, so the first part is easy. If we want it to be horizontally aligned in the center, we simply have to click on the alignment button and click on horizontally in center. And then we add that constraint and it's now in the middle. But now we get some errors because it doesn't know how to lay it out on the vertical axis. So should it be here? Should it be here? Should it be, where should it be? Well, now we're going to use our combo move where we click on the add a constraint menu and we set it to be 30 pixels from the App Brewery logo. So let's change that to 30, and we can click on the drop down list to make sure that we're actually putting that 30 pixels relative to the App Brewery logo rather than the view or the safe area or something else. So now let's make sure that again says 30 and then click add a constraint, and now the errors go away, and when we turn it to landscape, it'll still be in the center horizontally, but it'll be 30 pixels below the logo. So we've now learned about the two main type of rules that we can set, or constraints, which are the alignment constraints as well as the pinning constraints. In the next lesson, let's tackle some more complex layouts, namely our main.storyboard, using some of the things that we've learned, but also creating some containers to embed our elements in so that we don't always have to align or pin it to the super view. For all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. All right, so now that we've learned about the basic components of constraints, namely alignment and pinning, we're ready to move on to our more complex interface, which is our main.storyboard. So if we head over there, you can see that we've got the same kind of green background and we want it to cover all four sides. So as the first challenge to review what you learned in the last lesson, add some constraints to that background green felt so that even when it's in landscape, it covers all four sides without stopping at any of the safe areas. Pause the video and try to complete this challenge. All right, so just as before, we're going to select the item that we want to add a constraint to, either in the document outline or on the canvas, depending on how cluttered it is. And then we're going to go and set our constraints to be 0 from all four sides. And we can click on the drop down to make sure that it's actually selecting the view rather than the safe areas. And now we've got 0 from all four sides of the super view here. And now we can add our constraints and we can check in landscape as well as portrait. And also we can inspect our constraints in more detail by clicking on it and looking at the attribute inspector. So that's pretty easy, but the next part gets harder because how are we going to lay out all four of these elements on screen in this layout and make sure that it looks decent in the landscape orientation as well? Because the problem here is that, firstly, we can't simply just use alignment because we don't actually have anything that's right in the middle of our screen. There's nothing that exists here. And if we wanted to use pinning, well, we don't actually have enough vertical space to be able to pin all of our elements together. So what can we do instead? Well, we could use some containers to split up the screen into 3 equal parts. And then we can embed each of these elements inside its own container. So now the super view to this particular logo will be this purple container, and we can set it to be vertically and horizontally aligned in the middle of that container. So let's give that a go. Let's start by creating a container. To do that, all we need to do is go to our object library and locate a view element. Now, because there's a lot of things that are called views, table view, image view, progress view, I find it's usually easier to type UI view, which is actually the underlying element here. And it's simply just an empty view. And in this case, we're using it to lay out some of the subviews. So something that we're going to put inside this container. Let's click and drag it onto our screen. And I'm going to put it somewhere near the top here. And then we're going to drag it out. And now we need to embed our Dicey logo inside this new view. And to do that, I'm going to click and select my Dicey logo and then drag it so that this little circle here is indented below the view. So this shows that it's going inside, whereas when it's alongside it, it means it'll be just parallel. So we know that the layout of our view goes from the bottom to the top. So this is at the very top, and then it's this at the next level, then this, and this is at the very bottom. So our eye is looking this direction. We could change where our Dicey logo lives relative to that new view, but in our case, we actually want it to be inside the view. So we need it to be embedded. So we get this effect. So now that we've embedded our Dicey logo in its own view, let's go ahead and embed these two dice image views in its own container in the middle. And I'm going to use a different way of embedding. I'm going to go to Editor, and then I'm going to go to Embed In, and I'm going to select a view. So now the two dice image views have been embedded in its own view. And it's exactly the same thing as what we did before, but it's perhaps a little bit easier, a little bit quicker. And finally, for the roll button, I'm going to show you a third way of embedding in a view, which is to click on this button and then embed in view. So depending on which method you remember or you find easiest, then you can choose whichever way you want to do it, but they all do the same thing. So now we have 3 views and they're all called view, so it's a little bit confusing. So we can go ahead and select it and then click on the identity inspector and give it a label. So we can call this one the middle view because it's right in the middle. And we can call this one the top view and maybe this one the bottom view. So now we've got all 3 on screen and we can collapse them and you can rearrange them if you want to make sure that it says top, bottom and middle, although be careful that you don't accidentally embed one of the views in another one. So by the end you should have all of them aligned to the same indentation, showing that none of these are inside each other, but they are all inside the super view. And now we have our 3 containers, which can now be used to lay out these subviews or these items that are inside it. So for example, our Dicey logo can now be aligned to the horizontal and vertical center of that top view. But notice that as soon as we do that, we get an error. If we click on this button, it tells us what the problems are. And it's because even though we've defined the constraints for the logo, well, the location of this container view is kind of ambiguous. We don't know where to put it for its X position or for its Y position, because it's currently kind of just hanging out in the middle without any constraints of its own. So how can we give it some constraints? Well, to explore that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.